Hi, my name is Rachel, and this is Fiction Writing in My Garage. This is going to be a basic video of the six most important elements to any story, short story, novel. So, anyone that's new to writing, this could be a good video for you to learn a few new things. If you're not new, then maybe this could be a refresher for you. But let's get started. Okay, so let's discuss the six main elements of a short story or a novel. We'll begin with plot. The plot is the sequence of events that make up the story. It can include the introduction, rising action, climax, fall action, and resolution, which we will get into later. Um, but let's move on to characters. Obviously, these are the people that move your story along. You have protagonists, antagonists, and supporting characters. They all help things moving along. The plot would be pretty boring without them. So let's move to the setting. This is the time and place where the story takes place. This includes the physical environment, cultural context, and historical time period. Next, we have the point of view. This is just the perspective or the voice from which the story is told. So we have first person, third person, and omniscient, which is an all-knowing narrator. Next is theme. Theme is the underlying message or basically the lesson of the story. This can be implicitly or explicitly stated, and it's often up to interpretation. And finally, we have conflict, the central problem or challenge faced by the protagonist. The conflict can be internal, mental, or emotional, or external, focused on outside forces or obstacles. Sometimes the conflict can be with the antagonist if you choose to make that your main character. Let's look at different elements of the plot. The introduction is pretty self-explanatory. It introduces the characters, the setting, and the plot. And basically, it should depict the time period, genre, and the main character's normal world in general. It's also where you hook the reader, so you'll want to make it impactful. Next, we have rising action. This comes right after the opening of a story, which is also known as the exposition. It is usually comprised of events that lay down breadcrumbs, ask questions, and set roadblocks and conflicts that must be overcome. Next, we have the climax. The story's climax is when the plot's conflict is resolved. It is often the most exciting part of the story, like when the hero saves the princess, discovers buried treasure, or slays the dragon. Imagine when you read a story that you are climbing up a mountainside. Next, we have the falling action, everything that takes place immediately after the climax. The purpose of the falling action is to bring the story from climax to resolution. Finally, we have the resolution, which is basically the ending to your story. It wraps up all the conflicts. Hopefully, there's some character development and basically just wraps everything up for you. Now, on to the characters. We have our protagonist, which is basically your main character. It can be a hero, an anti hero, whatever you choose. And then you have your antagonist, which is the opposite. It's usually someone that puts a conflict in the protagonist's way. This can be a villain. This can just be maybe someone that they don't get along with, that's redeemed at the end, anything you want. And finally, we have our side characters, which, let's say in Harry Potter, Ron, Hermione, we'll call them the main characters of the story. You could argue that Ron and Hermione are side characters, but for this point of view, I would say they're all main characters in the story. So the side characters, it's pretty obvious it would be Hagrid, um, it could be Neville, it could be pretty much anyone else. And it's pretty obvious who the antagonist is of that story. We shall not name him. So when it comes to writing your characters, you want to make sure that you think about the background of the character. The background, or what happens before the story, is just as important as writing your story. When you give the reader that information, then they can understand where the characters are coming from, maybe what put them in that position in that particular story, and it just helps with character development. Okay, so let's move on to the setting. The setting is also really important. It gives the reader a sense of time and place. You want to make sure that it's clear. You want to describe it as well as you can. You want to give that reader a vivid picture in their mind. You also want to give background to develop the plot and characters. The setting can be crucial to elements like plot in your novel or short story. So, if you're writing a romance novel, is it going to be in the modern time? Is it the 1950s? Or is it way back in, Tudor era, 1500s? All of that matters to your story because the clothing is different, the locations can be different, and courtship was different in every time period. So, you want to make sure you provide that. The setting can also create a mood and gives the reader context. It can also provide plot devices. You can turn your geographical location into its own entity or an antagonist itself that can influence your main character. So, point of view or POV is basically how you're telling your story. Your first person, excuse me, POV is basically probably one of the most common. It's basically how we tell stories in everyday life. Basically, you're using I, we, my, and our. Um, this can create intimacy between the reader and the characters. You're getting direct access to the inner thoughts of every character or your main character. Um, and basically, stories where the protagonist's internal life is often the fore, and you will often find a first person narrative. So let's move on to second person. This is actually less common in literature, but it's not unheard of. So you're going to use you, your, and yours. And the second person POV is basically putting the reader directly in the headspace of a particular character, either the protagonist or a secondary figure. Um, so this can be alienating, but if it's executed well, it can create an intimate reading experience like no other. One example is Game of Thrones. When you read Game of Thrones, each chapter is told from a different point of view of every character. There are forefront, we'll call them main characters, even though the books really don't have a specific main character. Um, so basically, you're listening to the inner thoughts of every character and getting to see their point of view. Next is third person. Basically, everyone has read a third person narrative. It's full of he, his, she, hers, they. Um, it's basically where the narrator can only reveal the thoughts, feelings, and understanding of a single character at any given time, hence, third person. Between chapters, many books wrote in POV switch from character to character. Yet again, that could be an example of Game of Thrones or other novels. Um, so basically, we're on to third person omniscient. Uh, it's very popular and uses the same pronouns as third person. You're going to use he, she, him. It's popular because it allows a writer to pan out beyond the perspective of a single character. Um, you can go beyond the protagonist's comprehension, and at the same time, it also heavily relies on the voice and authority of the narrator, and therefore takes some focus away from the character. And finally, we have the theme. This is very important. You want your readers to find meaning in your writing, and here are a few really common themes. Love and relationships. Basically, everyone in a novel has some sort of relationship. Maybe not love, but some sort of relationship. Next, we have death and mortality. This is used very widely with horror novels, obviously, but it can also be a part of literary fiction. Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, basically masters of that sort of theme. Next, we have betrayal and forgiveness. This is popular with a lot of literary fiction or maybe women's lit. Um, Maybe the character's overcoming something in their past, a family member, maybe. And next, we have growing up and coming of age. Obviously, young adult novels are basically this. A lot of memoirs also. Um, and we have identity and self discovery. Again, this is very common in young adult novels. Then we have survival and resilience. This is common in dystopian fiction. The Hunger Games is a great example. Katniss Everdeen has to survive the trials of her dystopian setting. Okay, so we have good versus evil, which that's also common in pretty much any genre. Um, this can also be, again, you can flip it on your head. It could be the anti-hero versus a hero, something like that to make your writing more interesting. Next, we have time and the passage of time. This is common in fantasy novels. Usually they expand over several years. Not everyone, but when you think about it, when there's 7 or 8 books, obviously that's a long time period. Finally, we have justice and injustice. So a lot of cop thrillers. Obviously, the justice and injustice don't always go hand in hand. There's a lot of injustice, and if you've read a lot of cop fiction, there could be corruption, so it's justice versus injustice within the police force. Next, we have isolation and connection. This is another one that's really important. Um, there is a novel called Circe, which is a fiction retelling of Circe in Greek mythology. She is sent to an island to live, isolated from everyone else. And whenever someone stops on her island to visit, that's when she shares a connection with them, which is very important to her. The last element we're going to talk about is conflict. So there are several different kinds of conflict, and these are some of the most common. We have person versus person. This is also common, and it's 2 characters who have opposing goals, and it can lead to a verbal or physical conflict between characters. Next, we have the person versus self. A character is struggling with an internal conflict, such as decision making or moral dilemmas. It's usually a struggle through thoughts and emotions. Next, we have person versus nature. This conflict involves a character who is struggling against the forces of nature, like a natural disaster or a wild animal. Next, we have person versus society. This arises when a character is struggling against societal norms, such as laws or cultural expectations. Then we have person versus technology. This occurs when a character is struggling against technological advancements or issues, like hacking a computer or robots that turn on society. Um, and finally, we have person versus fate. This involves a character fighting against an outcome that has already been decided, such as an unavoidable tragedy or destiny. This is also a great example with Harry Potter. Is it his fate to die, or will he defeat Voldemort? That's something he struggles with all of the books. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you learned something new.